Good afternoon. Good afternoon. In the last two lectures on the topic of contemporary issues, we have dealt with Kaizen, benchmarking, total quality management and the like. But talking of contemporary issues and in the course on human resource management, the course will not be complete unless we talk a little about change management and also learning organizations. So, I will first talk of change management. Change management has assumed very important consideration since the time a few years ago when the Indian economy set course on the path of liberalization, and the world too, with the WTO progressing, set its course on globalization of trade, business, economy, financial markets and the like. The result was, of course, that change was very rapid and competition grew at a very, very high pace. And therefore, whilst managing organizations for the human resources manager, for the human resource development, change and adaptation to change, meeting change, overcoming change, riding with change has become all the more important. Now, what are some of the determinants of the change? One, of course, is globalization, but the changing nature of the employees too is one of the reasons why we see change in organizations and why we also need to adapt the organization to meet the changes in the environments. Today, we have more and more educated employees, we have more and more women joining the workforce, and we have a multiracial workforce in our organizations. Technology, computers for information processing, on the workshop floor, CNC machining centers, robots for industrial work all over the factory, sometimes making the factory innocent of all people. You can have factories today which are entirely practically managed by robots and intelligent machinery. Economic shocks is another cause for change, and in the recent decade we have seen a number of these shocks. The oil shock, Southeast Asian real estate and currency collapse, competition, e-commerce, globalization, consolidation amongst industries in order to meet the competition, and changing social patterns, rise in divorces, delayed marriages, smoking becoming stigmatized, and so on. World politics, collapse of the Soviet Union, German reunification, collapse of apartheid in South Africa, and so on. So, all these are the determinants, these are factors, very broad macro factors which has ushered in change the world over, and organizations have to cope with change and overcome change and emerge victorious for growing and prospering. Now, if you look at change conceptually, you may say there are two types of changes. One is the planned change and the other is unplanned. Change may be sudden or accidental, planned or goal oriented. Change is caused, as we said, by various determinants, by the changing forces in the environment in which the organization operates. Change also varies in magnitude. We can say first order change is linear and continuous change, that is incremental in nature, and the second order change is multi-dimensional, change along many fronts and multi-level, across many levels, and discontinuous and radical. So, we have the planned change and the sudden or radical change. Who are change agents? Change agents are the people who manage a planned change. They catalyze and drive change. They may be insiders, that is managers or employees of the organization itself, or they may be outside consultants. When we talk of change within the organization to cope with the changes in the environment, what are the items or what are the structures or what are the departments or divisions or the work elements within the organization which require this change, which require to be changed? Well, one can look along broad lines. One can look at the structure of the organization. The change can take place in authority relationships, coordination mechanism, job redesign, and so on. Change can occur in the technology, the methods of processing work, and change machinery and equipment, modernization, and the like. One can talk of change in the physical setting also, the space and the layouts and the workflow patterns within the factory. And of course, one can talk of change in people, which means changing of skills, upgrading of skills, changing attitudes, changing expectations, changing perceptions, changing behavior, and in short, changing culture, cultural change. Is it easy to do that? Of course not, because the human being eternally seeks stability. Remember that. We all are very comfortable with familiarity, familiar conditions, familiar work, familiar people, and we do not like, we have discomfort when something uncertain occurs or when we are in an environment which appears to us unknown, it appears hostile. So, we like stability, we like equilibrium, and therefore, when we are confronted with a situation where this stability is threatened, when disequilibrium looms on the horizon, we marshal our efforts to resist this change. So, resistance to change is natural and universal. It cuts across all countries, it cuts across all cultures, all human beings. It is natural for them to resist change. And resistance to change can be benign as it makes systems stable, because that also can be done when you have uncertain turbulence occurring in the environment. You have to cope with it. So, you change something, and that change you may call benign, because you are changing to resort to the status quo, so to say, or to make a new situation where stability and equilibrium again comes. But change can also be dysfunctional when it opposes planned changes, right? Resistance can oppose the planned change, and to cope with the environmental changes which the management wants to bring in, although it may be good for the organization, but people within the organization may not perceive it as such, and that then becomes a dysfunctional resistance. Resistance may be overt, it may be immediate, it may be implicit, or it may be deferred. Overt and immediate change is easier to deal with by management. Why is that? Simply because overt is something which is on the surface, which is something which you can see, right? And immediate change is something which is here and now. It is more visible. You can observe it, and therefore, you can respond and try to cope with that change. But something which is deferred, which is implicit, that is hidden, it is there, but you can't see it as a management. Those are more difficult to deal with. So, resistances, therefore, we categorize into these 4 categories. Factors that resist change. Now, take the human individual. He resists change. Why? By selective information processing. What does that mean? That means he or she chooses to see in whatever data and information which the management provides, that which suits him or her to see. Habit is another factor which causes people to resist change. Security. Security is familiar surroundings, no uncertainty, one feels secure. So, one resists anything that comes to upset that security. And of course, economic factors. Change can bring with it reduction in benefits, reduction in jobs, and so on. And these are very life and death economic factors which may affect people. And of course, fear of the unknown. If there is going to be a change, if there is going to be a restructuring within the organization, and you can be transferred to another department of the organization, you may have to be retrained. That means skills which you have learned over a lifetime, so to say, of your career, past career. You may have to unlearn some of it, relearn new skills and techniques, which may take you some amount or give you some amount of discomfort, which you may not be able to master. And these are various fears which are unknown in the uncharted area, which you are not sure you will be able to cope with any amount of, shall we say, distinction. Apart from the individual change, let us consider organizational resistance. So, the individual resists change, but there is something called the organizational resistance too. Threat to existing resonance allocation or resource allocation. Resource. Every department in every organization has got some allocation of resources, and since resources are always limited, all right, there is always a allocation where some gain and some lose. And in the process, managers and people, they fight for limited resources. So, the organization in that sense, in terms of its departments and its people, all right, they resist change because the unknown. You do not know whether you lose some of your resources which have been allotted to you. Structural inertia. Just like we said, individuals by habit, they don't want to change. So, by habit means inertia. You are familiar with doing things in a certain manner, familiar with certain people, and you don't want to have anything unfamiliar. So, in the organizational context, we can call it as a structural inertia. Threat to limited established power relationships. See, whenever you have change in the organization, there will be issues of restructuring, there will be issues of reallocation of powers. So, whatever the power centers that exist today are likely to be changed, and therefore, you may lose some of your power. Someone else may gain some of your territory, so to say, and therefore, this comes as a threat. So, organizationally you resist it. Threat to expertise. Say you are used to manual systems. When computerization comes, at that time you change over to the information technology, and you feel that the new expertise which has come, you will not be able to cope with it, and therefore, you try to resist it. And the same on the shop floor. You have had conventional machines, you try to introduce CNC machines, and the worker has to be retrained, something new which he has to do, something unfamiliar, and it becomes a threat. It becomes, in his perception, something which will take away his skill. A highly skilled workman, a fitter, or a highly skilled electrician, if you have computers and robots taking over the job, obviously there is a threat, and therefore there is resistance. And then group inertia. As a group, all of us tend to fall into a kind of group somnolence. That means the inertia prevents us from moving. Change denotes movement, denotes action, okay? And the group inertia is something which organizationally it keeps on doing the same thing over and over, what is familiar with them, and the group collectively resists the change. Right? It is like the boiling water frog syndrome. You heard about that. You put a frog into a can of water and heat it slowly. As the water keeps getting warmer and hotter, the frog swims around, okay, and then keeps on getting more agitated, keeps swimming around until the temperature is raised to a point where the frog dies. This is an illustration often given to show that group inertia, right, structural inertia is something which allows or which makes organizations even succumb, die, without adopting course of actions which make them change, which could have prevented the death. And on the other side, say you have a can of boiling water and you throw a frog into it, what will happen? Promptly the frog will jump out. And this is another example given to say that if there is a radical change, the underpinnings of your business swept away and you are in a cataclysmic crisis, very often you find that the group activates itself, the group inertia disappears, and therefore change is ushered in, and that saves the situation. The company is saved, they don't succumb. The frog jumps out of the can of boiling water. So these are some of the analogies which are given to illustrate the fact that the two types of changes, radical change, although it seems very much more or very much worse, in a sense it is better because you can react to it immediately and not let inertia of your company, all right, prevent you from taking those necessary steps, all right, without which you will perish in the end, in case if you have only incremental changes over a number of years. Any questions up to now? Okay. So, having said that change is inevitable, change is there all the time, you have two types of changes, human beings resist change, which is natural. So, how does a management, all right, manage this resistance to change and usher in change? So, one is education and communication. Education and communication. Participation, there is systems, policies and procedures which have to be brought in, where you broad base the decision making, which means participation is really participation in decision making at various levels. Facilitation and support by management. Negotiation, sometimes management has to negotiate with groups of workmen who are resisting change, and settlement comes whereby it is agreed that the change will be accepted provided XYZ. Manipulation and co-optation, which means that there is some amount of Machiavellian practices which some managements use to usher in change, and of course coercion. One can never get away from that when you bring in change as a management without going into the ethicality of it. Coercion is used very often in order to bring change into an organization. Why? Because in order to resist, right, or in order to move the resistance which you meet when you are trying to bring in change. So, here is a theory of change management. This is Levin's 3-step model. It says here unfreezing, movement and refreezing. What is unfreezing? Efforts made to overcome the pressures of both individual resistance as well as group resistance, right, as well as group conformity, that is status quo, no change, no movement. The second step is movement to a new state of status quo. So, you change the stability, you have disequilibrium, and then you go to a new state and bring in stability. That means you have to put an alternative action plan, an alternative model, an alternative stable situation where management would like you to go by changing your present situation. Okay. Then refreezing. once management has achieved to usher in the change, one can't afford to have that change, stable situation again becoming uncertain. So, refreezing it. So, from one state. So, conceptually change means unfreezing, movement which is the action to the new model, and the refreezing. Is that clear? Okay. Action research, a change process where there are sequential steps: diagnosis, analysis, action, feedback, and evaluation. So, these are the processes sequentially that you have to follow overall at a macro level when you are trying to bring change in the organizations. Okay. Now, in order for you to bring in change, you have to take certain actions, and often these actions which are taken to bring about a planned change in the organization is called organization development, or OD for short. One definition is a collection of planned change interventions. Interventions means actions taken by management. Interventions built on humanist democratic values. These are the key words of this definition. Humanist democratic values that seek to improve organizational effectiveness and employee well-being. So, the key words here in this definition are intervention, that is something which is planned and executed by management based on humanistic democratic values. And why does it do that? To improve organizational effectiveness and at the same time employee well-being. The employee is very much the central focus. The underlying values of organization development efforts are, and this is important because this is the humanist democratic value based intervention, is A, respect for people, B, trust and support, C, power equalization, D, confrontation. And when it says confrontation, it means what we say constructive confrontation, that is in order to overcome resistance to change with mutual respect, but constructively, that is giving alternatives which are acceptable. One confronts and not brush problems under the carpet as if the problem did not exist. And then participation. Participation is of course involvement of a large number of people in 2 or 3 elements. That is, one is of course information sharing, sharing information with the people, all right, thereby trying to get involvement of the people, and then which results in participation. And finally, the participation then reflects itself into some sort of commitment which the people have to the new changes which the management is trying to bring about. Okay. So, any questions about it? So, in change management, organization development is necessary. These are interventions, all right, which the management have to take based on a humanistic democratic philosophy. Okay. And there are some techniques of OD interventions like sensitivity training, that is seeking behavior change by unstructured group interaction. So, this is a psychological technique which is used with groups of people, all right, in trying to change the attitudes. Survey feedback, there is questionnaires to elicit or identify discrepancies amongst members' perceptions. That is, you take a questionnaire, you give it to each of the members, often anonymously they answer it, you get it back, you analyze, you collate everything, and then you get from that a feedback about what your employees are thinking about the organization, about the management, of their conditions of work, and so on and so forth. process consultation, building awareness and insights of self as well as others, right. Team building, high interaction amongst team members to build trust and openness. Intergroup development, changing attitudes, perceptions and stereotypes that group have of each other. There are very important considerations, these stereotypes which people have of each other. For instance, the accounts department are often viewed as stodgy people, number crunchers, who are very loath to give you any money, to make payment. That is a stereotype which is often existing about people who work in the accounts department or people working in the sales department. A stereotype is they don't do work, they are flamboyant, they are not very reliable because they talk too much, they make a lot of promises which they don't keep, and they go and meet clients and tour the country, whining and dining people, and not much work is done. So, this is a kind of stereotype which people working in the marketing and sales have, and so on. So, intergroup development is aimed at changing these attitudes and perceptions and stereotypes that groups have of each other, so that they see the reality of the situation, and then it makes it easier for them to adopt to new ways of working, and they see clearly what is the interdependence which each group has on the other, and the synergy that can be created if they have the right attitudes about each other and work together, and thereby produce synergy. So, that is about change management, and as I said early on in this lecture, we also touch upon the topic of organization, learning and learning organization. Now, what is the difference between the two? Let us start with that. Learning organizations can be defined as organizations where people continually expand their capacity to create the results they truly desire, where new and expansive patterns of thinking are nurtured, where collective aspiration is set free, and where people are continually learning to see the whole together. Now, this is by Peter Senge, very famous gentleman who has talked about learning organizations and written futuristic scenarios of what is going to happen in society. A company that can respond to new information by altering the very programming by which the information is processed and evaluated. Now, this is a definition given by McGill in 92. So, the concept then, as per these definitions, as you can see, of the learning organization is based on the saying, learn as if you could never have enough of learning, as if you might miss something. That is, there are always opportunities in the environment, in the organizational environment, to learn, and it should be a passion and a commitment and obsession that you will miss something if you don't continue to learn all the time. This is the learning organization. And I said early on, let us see what the difference between organizational learning and learning organization. Well, best is to give an analogy. Analogy is the final product is the learning organization. And organizational learning is a process by which you make this product, or learning organization can also be said as the ultimate goal that you want to reach, and organization learning, yes, is a process, the actions by which you reach that goal. So, this is basically in essence the difference between learning organizations and organizational learning. Now, some of the components which form the basis of the learning organization, because ultimately one of the contemporary issues is within this competitive environment, We want to achieve a state in our organization where there is continued learning happening all the time and where we become a learning organization. So, some of the components in order for us to reach this state is systems thinking, personal mastery, mental models, shared vision and team learning. Now, these are the punch shield, so to say, the 5 components by which learning organizations can form and can be made. Let us look at them one by one. The conceptual cornerstone that underlines or underlies all of the 5 learning disciplines, all the 5 we talked about just now. So, that is the thinking, the systems thinking. What does that mean? That means you think always of the organization and of the issues which confront it in a holistic manner. You think of it, all right, in a macro level first. That means you take the helicopter view instead of analyzing it immediately and looking at the constituent elements, because if you do that, then the theory says you will miss out the wood for the trees. You have heard of that? If you are standing in a forest with very tall trees around you, the trees become very important. They become the focus of all your attention. And you do not really know how big or how many trees there are. You lose focus of the fact that these trees may belong to a very small forest or it may belong to a very large forest. So, the overall focus is lost. But say you get on top of a helicopter and go on top, you can immediately see the focus, all right, of whether it is a small forest or large forest. So, the helicopter view is a holistic view. So, systems thinking is a conceptual cornerstone that underlies all of the 5 learning disciplines. Seeing relationships rather than linear cause and effect chains. So, linear cause and effect chains are looking at components. Because of this cause, this outcome happens. Because of this behavior, you get this result. So, instead of looking at that, you look at interrelationships, okay, amongst all the constituents of your organization. Seeing patterns and world as a whole as it grows more and more complex. Seeing processes of change rather than snapshots. What are snapshots? The still camera, you take a snap, it shows people frozen in time, okay, and space. But if you have a movie camera, what do you see? You see the same people, all right, interacting with others. You see movement. You see a process happening. Makes realities more manageable. An antidote for a feeling of helplessness, all right. System thinking is an antidote for a feeling of helplessness, because you see the larger view. You see what is happening, you see, at a macro level, and then you find solace and solutions, hopefully, to see how you can cope with it, instead of looking at one little component of it and then falling into hopelessness. So, then systems thinking is based on the fact that incomplete thinking results into partial relationship between the elements of the system. Hence, it emphasizes that we see the patterns and the world as a whole. So, it keeps driving away at the central point, that do not look at cause and effect, do not look at constituent elements, you look at whole system. Now, say for example, here you have a cause and effect that is looking not wholly, but partially. You say foreign arms is a threat to the United States, and because it is a threat, that is the cause, United States needs to build arms, okay, or United States builds arms, therefore, it is a threat to other nations. So, the other nations start building. So, cause and effect. Remember, during the Cold War, you had a constant, all right, battle between US and the Soviet bloc. You had what is known as the arms race. It was looked at in this sort of manner. The non-systematic view focuses on snapshots, as we said, rather than the whole thing, because it looks at cause and effect. It suggests that only if other countries will reduce their arms, so only if Russia stops making more arms, then only the United States will reduce. Hence, systems thinking requires identification not of the snapshots, but of circles of causality, of feedback loops, that is reinforcing, balancing or delaying. What does that mean? That change in one part of the system causes change in the other part. That small changes amplify, causing accelerated growth or decline. Consider here a conceptual form. You have foreign arms here, it becomes a threat to US. Therefore, there is a perception in that to need in US to build arms. All right, so the US has a perception to build arms to counter affect the threat. When it does so, it becomes in turn a threat to the other nations, who then feel the need to again build arms themselves, which again they do, and that in turn becomes threat to the US. So, if you see this, this is known as taking a systems view, looking at a closed feedback loop, looking at the whole system instead of a linear cause and effect. Balancing feedback leads to goal seeking behavior. Resistance to change is a balancing process, limits growth or decline. There is also an element of delay when we are talking of learning organizations. Effect on variables takes time. Consequences of actions occur gradually. The same loop which we saw in the previous slide. Foreign arms, threat to US, US arms, threat. There is a delay at each stage. There will be a delay. Each stage there will be a delay. So, this has to be taken into consideration when you look at the macro view of learning and say it cannot happen overnight, but there is a built-in delay or a minimum lead time for bringing about changes in a holistic manner. Next, we said out of the 5 components, all right, systems thinking was one. The second is personal mastery, core discipline needed to build learning organizations. Organizations learn only through individuals who learn. Remember that. Organization is a collection of individual human beings. So, they learn only through individuals who learn. However, individual learning does not necessarily guarantee organizational learning, but individual learning is necessary, because without it, no organizational learning can occur. Constitutes 2 components, this learning: personal vision, that is definite picture of the desired future, and creative tension. Tension means gap between where one is currently functioning and where one wants to be. So, pictorially, this is creative tension. You have here the vision where you want to be, and here is the current reality, all right. And in order for the current reality to reach the vision, there has to be a pull so that this can approach the vision. So, you have a tension here. Next, we said the third element is mental models. One way of looking at the world, all right, that is how you look at the world, one's way of looking at the world. What perspective you look at the world. Framework for cognitive processes of our mind. So, these are all mental models. Determines how we think and act. Mental models are so powerful because they affect what we see. If we are a negative person mentally, what we see we always interpret in a negative mode, and the reverse if you are positive. So, mental models are so powerful because they affect what we see, what we perceive. It includes the ability to carry on what we call learning-full conversations, and that balance inquiry and advocacy. Inquiry and advocacy. When you are learning, one of the ways is to ask questions. So, inquiry. And what is advocacy? Advocacy is talking about a cause, something which you believe in, you advocate. You want that to happen. You want that change to happen. You want a new vision and the vision to be achieved. So, you advocate the new vision. Necessary for people in organization to learn new skills and develop new orientations. So, in a learning organization, you have to have people with energy, enthusiasm, and a willingness to learn new things and new techniques. Fourth was shared vision, which means a common caring built on a common set of shared values of the individuals in the organization. Begins with an individual vision, that is something one holds as truth and holds as near and dear. Shared vision is created by compromising between the individual's visions and their development in common direction. Now, why do you say compromising? See, the point being made here is because it's a shared vision, sometimes in order to share, one has to give and take. So, when you give something, you think you are compromising something, but you take something and equalize it. So, therefore, by that token it says created by compromising, give and take between your own and all other individuals' own visions and all of us developing in a common direction. Leaders should not force his vision, rather encourage initiative by all. And shared vision helps establishing overarching goals. What does overarching goals mean? It means that the goals and objectives of each of the departments of the organization are important, but the overall objective of the organization is more important. And if the individual goals of the departments, they are contrary and they affect the overall goals of the organization, then the individual departmental goals must always be subordinated to the organizational goals. So, that is overarching. And last is team learning. This is very, very important, possibly after the systems thinking approach of the top management. Team learning along the vertical and horizontal axis of an organization, that is across departments and across levels, that is the most important for achieving learning organization. So, first is alignment. This is necessary condition before empowering the individual and empowering the whole team. So, it is a cascading effect. You empower the individual. When each individual is empowered, it causes synergy. It creates synergy, and the entire team is energized. A large number of organizations now, particularly in the United States, have started doing their normal operational activities using the team concept instead of the traditional departmental concept. Okay? And the findings are that they seem to get much better performance and outcomes because of this synergistic effect which comes. When people work together, they trust each other, and in the whole process what happens is there is a collective learning. A team comprising of cross-functional members, departments of marketing, manufacturing, HR, if you have managers from each of these departments working on a project, all right, then each member learns something beyond his or her narrow confines. A finance man learns something about marketing, a marketing learns something about manufacturing and so on. And in the whole process there is a kind of osmosis by which a kind of collective learning happens. This is what organizations are finding out today. And barriers are broken, functional barrier, turf, everyone zealously guarding his turf. Departmental considerations are then subordinated to the consideration of the whole, the project, and finally the organization. Starts with dialogue, that is capacity of the members to suspend assumptions and enter into genuine thinking, and builds on personal mastery and shared vision. Dynamic learning of the organization is based on some theories. Linear model, that is learning of organization, is based upon or is associated to the individual learner, that is the theory of linear model. Whereas the action system model, the theory states, learning of organization is composed of actions of individuals, the group, and the organization. That is action oriented and multi-tiered, individual, group, as well as the organization. And the learning systems model says transformation of information into valued knowledge. The information is transformed into valued knowledge through system of actions, actors, symbols, and processes. Okay. So, culture is very important in this. It keeps on building a certain culture through a system of work. Say team working is a system you have established, of the actions, that is joint recommendations which come out of the team's efforts. Actors, who are the people? It's cross functional, you have people from various departments. Symbols and rituals which you go, which builds the culture, and the processes which you follow. Okay. So, this is the learning systems model, which is the third theory. And here is a kind of comparison of these three. So, you have the linear model, which has information filter, information transfer, action and reflection, knowledge creation, field, distribution of knowledge. This is the linear model, individual based. Action system model, exchange, because this is the action, production, goal attainment, coordination, integration, reinforcement, pattern maintenance. Learning system is environmental interface, adaptation, action and reflection with goal attainment, dissemination and diffusion with coordination, meaning and memory with pattern maintenance. Okay. The linear model includes 6 functions as we showed there: information, which is prevailing world news, and created market survey. So, prevailing is world news, is prevailing, that is information, but you can create information by a market survey and then ultimately transform that information into what? Valued knowledge by these processes. Filtering, transferring, action and reflection, and knowledge creation concerned with those who get knowledge and what information has been filtered. Distribution of knowledge within an organization to suitable units and individuals. And similarly, the chart enumerated the steps of the other 2 systems. So, goals of the organizational learning system, see, goals is to make it into a learning organization, as I said early on in this lecture. So, transforming of information into valued knowledge and introducing changes in the organization with the purpose of survival, growth, prosperity, improving the adaptive capacity of the organization. Remember, the learning is a process. When you say that this organization is a learning organization. Look at the very language. What does learning say? Learning says it's not frozen. Learning denotes a continuity. So, a learning organization constantly has to adapt to the environment, forces of the marketplace, forces of the regulatory environment, forces of trade, commerce and so on, to keep on learning new things. So, in short, it never reaches the final goal, continues to learn, all right. An ultimate aim of the organizational learning is creation of knowledge, which in turn transforms that organization into a learning organization. So, what did we say earlier? Learning organization, all right, it transforms various information, data into valued knowledge. So, knowledge creation process, socialization. You see, this is a conceptual model. It says knowledge is created through the interaction of following three layers. First is socialization, externalization, combination and internalization, for short SECI. Platforms of knowledge creation, knowledge assets or inputs, outputs and moderator of the knowledge creation process. So, you have knowledge assets, you have this process of socialization, externalization, combination and internalization. You have platforms of knowledge. These are the three layers, they interact with each other. Platforms of knowledge feed into this process and in turn it creates knowledge assets. Knowledge assets in turn feed into the process again, all right, and the knowledge assets then moderate what platforms of knowledge you get fed in. So, the whole process is interconnected and the ultimate deliverable is creating valued knowledge from information and data. Here are some of the conditions for learning in organization. Combining learning with an instrumental objective, that is association of learning with central task system of the organization. So, it must be operational, the learning must be connected with the basic operations of that organization. Generating optimal uncertainty to enhance the learning by venturing beyond what is already known. That is encouraging through systems and practices people in the organization not being satisfied with something which is known, standard, but taking risks and going beyond. Controlling the learning process jointly to enable the organization to adapt the learning process to its own particular situation. Some of the barriers to organizational learning which we said early on, this is a process to create a learning organization, is interrupted learning, all right. Psychological and cultural types of barriers, barriers related to organizational structures and relationships. And of course, the managements can adopt various strategies to overcome these barriers, all right. And why do learning organizations work at all and work better than others? Because of three basic reasons. People develop in a learning organization themselves as individuals, all right. Number two, they work as teams in learning organizations. Teams and groups work better than doing it individually and through compartmentalized departments. Company benefits as a whole in this process, and the conclusion is that learning is important contribution to revitalization of the organization. Organizational learning takes place through transformation of information into valued knowledge. Learning in the organization must be equal to or greater than change in the environment, otherwise difficult for it to survive. It must always be a few steps ahead of the change, mastering the change, otherwise it will not survive. Learning organization is not attainable goal, it is merely a desirable concept because of the very fact that can never learn everything that there is to learn. continue to learn, and you have a vision, you strive to reach the vision, but you never reach it. Continue the learning process. So that is some of the contemporary issues which we have covered over the last 3 lectures. Thank you very much.